The morning of my wedding, my mother-in-law came into the room where I was dressing. Not to help with my cap, not to say a prayer over me. She walked in, closed the door behind her, and looked at me the way you look at a horse before you agree to a price. She walked a slow circle. She checked the set of my shoulders. She pressed her palm flat against my lower back and told me to stand straight. She looked at my hands, turned them over, checked the knuckles. She nodded once at my hips, said nothing about my face, said nothing about my heart. When she was done, she said, in a voice as flat and certain as a door closing, "You'll do." Then she left. I was 20 years old. I had been awake since 3 a.m, and I stood in that room alone, wondering what would have happened if she had decided I wouldn't. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Geauga County, Ohio. I left some years ago now, and this channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, is where I say the things my community would never permit me to say out loud. If you want to hear more hidden truths like this one, please subscribe and tap the like button right now. And drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one, because I need to know who is on the other side of this screen. I need to know I am not talking into silence. Now, let me explain what you just watched, because I know it sounds strange. A mother-in-law walking into a bride's room on her wedding morning and inspecting her like a piece of furniture. I have told that story to English women and watched their faces change. Confusion first, then something slower, darker, harder to name. But inside my world, inside Geauga County in the late 1990s, nobody called it strange. Nobody called it anything at all. It simply happened, the way 100 other things simply happened, without being named or questioned or held up to the light. And to understand why, you need to understand something about how Old Order Amish marriage actually worked. Not the version in the documentaries, not the version on the tourist farms with the buggy rides and the quilts in the gift shop, the real version from inside it. In my community, marriage was not primarily a union of two people who had chosen each other. It was a union of two families, two farms, two bloodlines, two futures stretching forward into decades of shared labor and shared pews and shared standing before God. A young man's family was not simply gaining a daughter-in-law. They were acquiring a worker, a child-bearer, a keeper of the house, a pair of hands that would operate from before dawn until after dark for the rest of her functional years. They were making a permanent and irrevocable decision. And permanent decisions, in my community, required due diligence. That is not my bitterness speaking. That is the framework I was handed. And it is important that you understand it was not malice. The theology underneath it was submission. Complete, without negotiation, without appeal. A wife was given by God into the keeping of her husband and his family, and they had every right, in that framework, to know what they were receiving. It was considered responsibility. The men who arranged these matches, the fathers and bishops and deacons who moved the pieces on the board, genuinely believed they were doing something ordered and holy. That is the part that took me the longest to unravel in therapy. The harm was delivered with complete sincerity, by people who had never been given a single reason to question it. The inspection had no official name. It did not appear in the Ordnung, the community rules that governed everything from the width of a hat brim to the length of a hem. But it happened. It happened to me. And when I finally, carefully, years after leaving, began asking other women who had married into that district, I found I was not alone. Some women described a single prolonged look, an appraisal across a supper table the first time they ate in their future in-laws' home. Some described comments passed secondhand, delivered to their own mothers, about their build, their teeth, their apparent capacity for physical labor. One woman I will call Ruth told me that 2 weeks before her wedding, her future mother-in-law had sent specific questions through an intermediary. Whether Ruth had ever been sick as a child, what kind of sick, how long it had lasted, whether she had recovered fully and without lasting effect. Ruth's mother answered every question. Ruth was never asked whether she minded being discussed this way. The question did not occur to anyone to ask. That is not cruelty. That is a world in which a woman's comfort with being discussed was not a variable anyone had thought to include. I had been promised to Samuel when I was 19. Promised is not precisely the right word. There was no formal arrangement, no written contract, no ring placed on a finger. That is not how it worked. It was more like a current that moved through the air around us and simply carried me. His family began appearing at church in a particular way. My father began speaking of Samuel's farm with a specific attention. Sunday meal invitations flowed in one direction, with a regularity that everyone understood and no one named. When Samuel asked me formally, at his family's kitchen table with both our fathers present and no one else, I said yes. I said yes because I was 19, because I had been raised to say yes, because Samuel was decent in the ways I could measure, and because saying no would have required a certainty about my own worth and my own wants that nobody had ever told me I was permitted to have. The current moved in one direction, and I was in it, and that was the whole of my decision-making. The wedding was set for a Tuesday in early November. Amish weddings happen on Tuesdays and Thursdays after the harvest, when the fields are rested and the community can afford to stop and gather for hours. In the weeks before the date, I was examined without ever being examined openly. Samuel's mother, a tall woman named Miriam, visited our home 3 times in those weeks. Each time she watched me work, not to help, to watch. She watched me carry water from the pump to the kitchen, and I could feel her eyes counting the trips and measuring the ease of my stride. She watched me knead bread one afternoon with my sleeves rolled to my elbows, and I felt her attention on my hands and my wrists, and the way my shoulders absorbed the labor. One day my youngest brother stumbled in the yard, and I caught him before he hit the ground, lifted him, set him back on his feet without putting down the pot I was carrying in my other arm. I did not look at Miriam, but I felt her see it, felt her log it, felt the small internal adjustment of a woman making a final calculation. I understood at some wordless level what was being catalogued. I understood it the way you understand something before you have the language to speak it. And here is the part that took the most untangling in every hour of therapy I eventually sat through. That passing felt like something to be proud of. I was glad she found me adequate. I wanted to be found adequate. I had wanted to be found adequate my entire life. That want, that gladness, is the thing I had to sit with the longest, because it showed me how deep the training went, how early it had been placed in me, how completely I had accepted someone else's criteria as my own. The morning she came into my dressing room, the morning she pressed her palm to my lower back and walked her slow, deliberate circle, I did not cry. I did not object. I did not feel the full shape of what was happening, because I had no language for its shape yet. Language came much later, years after leaving, in a small office with a therapist who possessed a patience I still find difficult to fully comprehend. I was given words one at a time to build the sentence with. The first word she offered was objectified. I looked at it the way you look at an unfamiliar tool, turning it over, testing the weight. I said, "That is not quite right." She asked me why. I said, "Because an object does not know it is being treated as an object." And I knew. Something in me had always known. Even at 20, standing straight while Miriam's palm pressed my lower back, something in me registered what was happening and stored it in a place where I would not have to feel it until I was somewhere safe enough to feel it. I was not somewhere safe enough for a long time. The wedding itself was 4 hours long. We sat on hard wooden benches in my parents' front room, the furniture moved out the night before, the floors scrubbed, sermons and singing from the Ausbund, and the long declarative reading before the bishop, and then a meal for close to 300 people. I sat through all of it with Miriam's morning visit sitting in my chest like a stone I had swallowed. Samuel sat across the room with the other men, and when our eyes met briefly during the meal, I looked for something in his face. I'm not sure what, some acknowledgement that we were about to begin something enormous together, something that deserved more than a palm on my lower back and a nod at my hips. His face was calm, slightly flushed from the meal and the warmth of the room. He smiled at me, a small, decent smile, and I smiled back, and neither of us had any idea what the other one was carrying into that night. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform. Not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Samuel was not a bad man. I want to say that plainly, because I have learned that the English world wants a villain, and the truth is more inconvenient than a villain. He was 24 years old, and he had been given no more honest preparation for marriage than I had. He had been told what a wife was, the way you are told what a harness is practically, without sentiment, and he had absorbed that framing because no other framing had ever been offered to him. He was not cruel. He was absent in a way that was, in some respects, more difficult to name than cruelty would have been. He worked, he came home, he sat at the table, he slept. In between, I existed alongside him. I cooked, I cleaned, I carried, I bore children. I mended what broke and preserved what could be preserved and maintained what needed maintaining. I was the engine of the house, and he was its owner, and neither of us had ever been given any other way to understand what we were doing together. That is the truth, and it is a complicated truth, and I will not make it simpler than it is. What I did not know on the morning of my wedding was that the inspection would not end with Miriam's departure from that room. It had begun with that walk around my body, but it continued for years, in different forms, at different intensities, administered by different hands and different silences. How I set the table, whether the soap had been replaced before it ran out entirely, whether the children sat quietly enough through the long hours of church service, whether my figure returned quickly enough after each pregnancy, whether the food at the Sunday table was exactly what it needed to be, neither too much nor too little, neither too plain nor reaching beyond our station. I was continuously assessed and the score was never announced. I knew my standing the way you know the temperature of a room without looking at a thermometer. When approval was withheld, it came as a quality of silence, a different texture to the quiet at the supper table, a look that rested on me half a second longer than ordinary looking requires. An absence of the small daily acknowledgments that functioned, I understood only in retrospect, as my only feedback system. And I adjusted. I perpetually adjusted. I had been trained from early childhood to read those silences and respond to them. That training had never been called training. It had been called being a good woman. It had been called faithfulness. It had been called exactly what I had been taught to want to be. The deepest version of the inspection came after each of our children was born. There is a particular kind of scrutiny that a woman's body receives in a community where bearing children is understood as her primary function, and I want you to understand it clearly. After each birth, the question was not how I was feeling. The question, communicated in the 1,000 small ways I had learned to read, was whether I was recovering appropriately, whether the recovery was efficient, whether I would be ready to carry the next one. I was 22 when our first was born, 24 when our second came. By the third, I had begun to understand that my body was being evaluated on a timeline that had nothing to do with what my body actually needed. I said nothing about this for years. I had no language for it, and no permission to speak it, and no certainty that what I was feeling was real, rather than the pride, the hochmut, the sin of placing my own comfort above my duty. That confusion is one of the most effective features of the system. You cannot object to something you have been taught to mistake for your own failing. I left in my early 30s. It was not a single moment, because the truth is rarely a single moment, and I am finished shaping the truth into something easier to swallow. It was an accumulation, a slow filling that eventually tipped over. My youngest daughter had started asking me questions I did not have permitted answers for. Questions about why we did certain things and what existed beyond the county road, and whether I had ever, even once, wanted something different for myself. Sitting on the edge of my bed one November evening with the lamp throwing long shadows across the floorboards, I understood that I was about to pass the silence forward into her hands. I was about to give her the same wordlessness I had been given, the same absence of language for her own body, her own worth, her own right to exist as more than a function. I was about to wrap the silence up like something precious, like an inheritance, and place it in her keeping. And I could not do it. That was the moment. Not a dramatic exit, not a prepared speech, a quiet, total, irreversible refusal to pass the silence on. My English doctor asked me, at my first proper medical appointment after leaving, to describe my experience of that wedding morning. I described it as precisely as I was able, with the language I had been slowly accumulating. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "What you're describing is a normalization so complete that the practice required no defense, because it had never faced a challenge." I turned that over for a long time. My therapist said something I have returned to nearly every day since. She said, "The most effective systems of control are the ones that convince the controlled that the control is care." Miriam believed she was being thorough. She believed she was ensuring her son made a sound decision. She believed in the framework she had been given and had never once been invited to question, that she was doing right by everyone in that room, including me. That sincerity does not undo what her hands did to my body that morning. It makes the whole thing more complicated, and complicated things require more honesty than simple things, not less. What I think about most now, with the distance that years provide, is the permission I was never given. Permission to exist as a self that had worth apart from its usefulness. Permission to walk into my own wedding morning as a person rather than a candidate being evaluated for a position. Permission to feel the hand on my lower back and say, "Remove your hand. Do not touch me like that. I am not an animal at auction. I am not an applicant for a role. I am a person about to make the most permanent decision of her life, and I deserve to make it as a full human being, not as a body being certified for service." I did not have those words at 20. I have them now. I built them out of years of therapy and distance and the specific kind of grief that comes from understanding exactly what was taken from you and knowing the morning itself is gone and will not come back. Giving those words to you is the only thing that remains possible. The Amish world gave me things I carry and will always carry. A capacity for hard work that has never failed me. A relationship with quiet and with patience that is sometimes a gift. A faith that I dismantled completely and rebuilt from the pieces into something I can actually stand inside without shame. I do not need you to condemn everything I came from. But there is no theology that requires a woman to be walked around like a purchase on her wedding morning. There is no scripture that makes a hand on a young woman's lower back into something holy. There is no God I believe in now who designed a person and then intended for that person's worth to be verified in a slow circle before she was permitted to begin her life. It happened. It happened to me and to Ruth and to women before us both, in that district and in others, for generations, with nobody calling it what it was, because it had no name, because it needed no name inside the system that practiced it, because the silence around it was so total that naming it would have been the strange thing. That was the strange thing, not the inspection, saying no to it. If you grew up in a world that assessed your value before it asked your name, I see you. If you ever stood in a room and felt yourself being measured by hands that did not ask permission, I see you. If you were taught that silence was faithfulness, and compliance was virtue, and endurance was the same thing as grace, and you believed that for years because you had no other available belief, I see you. Your body was always yours. Your worth was never a determination that another person had the right to make. Nobody said those words to you. I am saying them now. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.